Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Johns Hopkins School of Education, Doctor of Philosophy, Student Panel Virtual Webinar. My name is Sion John. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Here with me, I have my colleague from the Office of Admissions, and she will introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tanya McMillan, and I'm an admissions coordinator here at the School of Education.
And presenting today, we also have Dr. Hunter Gelbeck, faculty lead of the PhD program, and 3 doctoral students here at SOE. And before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. First, today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please type your question in the chat box and we'll read and answer your questions. I would like to share the agenda for today's presentation. We will start with introductions, then Dr. Gelbeck will go over some tips on how to submit a successful PhD application at SOE. Then you'll have the opportunity to hear directly from our current doctoral students. And lastly, we will leave the floor open for questions at the end. Moving on to faculty introduction. Dr. Hunter Gelbeck is the faculty lead for the Doctor of Philosophy program at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Dr. Gelbeck joined SOE in 2019, received his PhD at Stanford University, and Dr. Gelbeck's research focused on improving the social and motivational context of schools. At this time, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Gelbeck. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Sion. Gosh. Huge thanks for coming. Really appreciate you guys taking the time. I realize it's getting into a pretty busy time of year. And I also am not clear on how many of you were able to make it to either of the first 2 sessions. But our kind of goal and the vision for today is to really just sort of pick up where we left off. And, you know, applications are due kind of soon, December 15th. And so give you a couple thoughts and insights into, what would make your application even stronger. So that's kind of the game plan. I'm going to keep my comments pretty short because I think probably most helpful and what you guys are most excited for is hearing from students who actually got into the program. They, in many ways, would be the real experts. So with that sort of context, the one sort of big emphasis of the prior 2 sessions was, as you're thinking about PhD programs, really thinking about the fit. And, you know, if your interests are Johns Hopkins School of Education, you want to be thinking, these are kind of the 5 things that I think make the program really distinctive. And so thinking about this apprenticeship experience, like you're likely to work with 1 or maybe a couple advisors pretty closely. There's also a cohort experience. So you want to sort of think about the balance there. But, you know, if the person studying what you really want to study is not here, you know, that's a concern away, I think. All right, fit number 2, if you're looking for an interdisciplinary approach, we talked about this before as well. You know, we do sort of have pillars and emphases on sort of both psychology or learning sciences and sociology, and try and use those disciplines to apply to sort of impact policy and practice. So those are kind of like our staples. It's not that we don't do other disciplines, but they are maybe not quite as heavily emphasized. All right, point number 3, rigorous methodological training. We're probably, I think it's fair to say, kind of lean still a little more quantitative, but we do have mixed methods. And I think in some ways, maybe the students are more methodologically diverse than the faculty. So there's a lot going on there. Feel free to ask them about their sense of that as well. But either way, whichever sort of, you know, more qualitative, more quantitative, mostly mixed, wherever you're headed, we do care a lot about making sure that methodology is rigorous, which ties into number 4, the research approaches of the future. We're thinking a lot about open science and transparency of methods, but then also these techniques like pre-registration and registered reports, things that address kind of systematic problems that are out there in the research world. So just to give a quick example of what I mean by pre-registration. So obviously really easy to run lots and lots of analyses on a data set these days. Computers make that very simple. But, you know, we know that by chance, if you run enough analyses, something's going to pop up significant. And humans are such good storytellers, it wouldn't be that hard to, you know, kind of make up a reasonably sensible, logical story about why this is a big, important finding, even though it's really a chance finding. And so the open science technique of pre-registration is just a way to safeguard against that. So you're listing out the hypotheses you're very explicitly going to test before you even peek at the data set. So stuff like that is a conversation that's just starting to happen in the field of education writ large, but Johns Hopkins has some of the best folks in the world on this topic. And so you'd be just sort of that much further ahead of the game. And so, and again, that I think is would make Hopkins a really good fit if you want to have this sort of more advanced training of where the field is going, as opposed to sort of, you know, catching up when lots of the rest of the people catch up to these new norms and practices. All right, last couple things here. You want to make an impact on education, practice, and policy through sort of research that bridges the divide. You know, we're very excited for stuff that makes both theoretical contributions and actually impacts the real world. And so, you know, other programs have different orientations, but that's very much, you know, if you come in with a great idea that is research for research's sake, you're going to get a lot of push. You're going to get a lot of questions about what's the practical significance of this, and vice versa is just as true. All right, so if we advance the slide, I think, you know, the parting thought on this slide is really, you know, thinking about sort of like, as you look through the faculty webpage, is the right person here? And if not, maybe it's the right combination of people. But I think of all the things that are probably most important for fit, the reason I've sort of pulled this one out as its own separate bullet point is this is probably the biggest question, right, that you should be asking yourselves. Is there either one person or this sort of combination of people who would really work well for me, fit my interests, bearing in mind, of course, that, you know, interests do change a little bit. So, so that hopefully brings you back from last time, sort of some of the highlights of what I think make the program here at Hopkins distinctive. And so with that, let's think about, like, great, how do I get in? And so on the next slide, you'll see some tips for sort of applying. And so the first kind of set of things that I'll talk through, and then I promise I'll be quiet and turn it over to the students. You know, it seems really helpful to communicate with the faculty, right? We just talked about an advisor or a combination of advisors. You know, question number one, are they taking students? And relatedly, do they plan on being at the institution moving forward? And that could be anything from, well, they're yes, they're going to be at the institution, but they're shifting into an administrative role. And so maybe they're only good for being sort of half of an advisor, and a co-advising situation would be better. Maybe they're going on sabbatical. Maybe they just got a fellowship that's buying them out. So figure out if they're going to be there and excited to have students for the, you know, years that you think you'll be there. So let me balance that comment with the next bullet point, which will pop up here, which is don't put all your eggs in one faculty basket. So even if they're like, yes, I'm taking students, yes, would love you to come here, no, I'm not planning on switching institutions or going on sabbatical or taking on a new role. You know, research interests change, and that happens on the faculty side and the student side. projects that faculty are really excited about at one moment that you might want to go and work with that faculty member on. Sometimes they change in sort of unexpected ways and directions. And so, making sure that if the person you think is absolutely the right advisor fit for you, if that doesn't work out, or if it's, sort of like you get there a year or two in, that person still makes for a good advisor, but is less centrally focused on the things that you're focused on, that there is some, almost like having some insurance, right? You've got some other people who are doing interesting stuff and other places you can go. So I think that's enough on that for sort of communicating with key faculty. And again, thinking about this balance between a faculty member, but also a collection of faculty that's going to be a good fit and work for you. And so after you've communicated with those key faculty, and I would say in your personal statement, very much mention the sort of presumed expected advisor by name. I think in general, and I think as we click to the next part of this slide, on the personal statement, a couple key themes. One is to not be afraid or not be bashful to sort of mention key faculty members by name. I think that really helps an admissions committee see how you're thinking about the fit. And then second thing that I feel like just kind of over the course of years of looking at these, I've really picked up is, seems like there's a difference between the people who can say, I'm really interested in this research topic, and they sort of talk about that in their personal statement, to I'm interested in these kinds of research questions. And so the sort of upper level talking about that research question, I think helps in a couple ways. One, it signals that you're really more ready to do research than if you're only coming up with a research topic. Two, it gives more clarity on sort of how and in what way and with whom you might be a good fit. So think about sort of orienting your personal statement that way, if that feels like it makes sense to you. And then the other thing on the personal statement that would be my sort of 2 bits is just keeping in mind that pretty much the bottom line question that the admissions committee is going to have is, what's your potential as a researcher? So there are a number of applications that come through that really talk about sort of overcoming hurdles and barriers and work ethic, and all those sorts of things are great and helpful. But if that personal story comes through with no signals about the potential as a researcher, it's, you could have overcome more and harder hurdles and barriers than absolutely anyone else. But if we don't have any idea if you're going to be a promising researcher, it's going to be pretty hard to make a case for you in that admissions meeting. All right, one more click and sort of last thing, right? So you're reaching out to faculty members before you submit your application, connecting, trying to find that fit. You're writing up your personal statement, hopefully with a research question, more so than just a research topic. The faculty are going to be trying to think through, like, what's your potential as a researcher. So then when you reach out and get your recommendation letters, thinking about faculty members or past supervisors who can really kind of reinforce or complement your statement. So, for example, if they can speak to your potential as a researcher, that would be great. Personally, like, I always find recommendations really hard because there's so much grade inflation. Everyone kind of seems to say in recommendation letters, oh my gosh, this person walks on water. They're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And so recommenders who can really talk about the type of researcher that Hopkins would be getting if they admitted you into the program, and getting a little more granular than and talking about some of the skills that you have, that I think can be really, really helpful. So with that, let me stop, because I think hearing from the students is probably going to be most helpful. So I will turn it back over to admissions, and we'll get introductions of our student panelists.
All right, thank you, Dr. Galbach. So here on the slide, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, Sarah Caroleo. Sarah is currently a second-year doctoral student at SOE. Her dissertation topic is on elementary teachers' decision-making about small group sorting and instruction. She graduated from Greenville University, and prior to enrolling in the PhD program, she taught for 8 years as a K-4 gifted specialist, and she was also an elementary school teacher. Next, we have Juan Cortez. Juan is currently a fourth-year doctoral student at SOE. His dissertation topic is on early warning indicators in K-12 education. He graduated from Catholic University of America, and prior to entering the PhD program, Juan's professional work focused on research and program evaluation in K-12 public school systems, first in Cleveland Metropolitan School District and most recently in Baltimore County Public Schools. Moving on, we also have Avery Davis. Avery is currently a third-year doctoral candidate at SOE. Avery's dissertation title is Working Hard for the Money, Students' Entry and Exit Experiences with Financial Aid. Prior to enrolling in the PhD program, Avery worked on his master's at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. For professional experience, he has served as the director of the President's Office and board management at Concordia College, New York. At this time, I will hand the floor back to Dr. Galbach.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. I'd love to just start with kind of the question of like, why did you choose to pursue a PhD in the first place? It's pretty big, several years out of your life. And I think that maybe hearing sort of some of the reasons and rationales and why you felt like it was a good idea will kind of help orient people as they're starting to think about those personal statements and sort of maybe final decisions about which programs to apply to. So Sarah, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thanks everybody for coming. I feel like my interest in a PhD program was really driven by my experience in teaching. Like Sion said, I taught for 8 years. I taught in a variety of contexts, like different types of schools. And in a lot of my experiences, I was either collaboratively planning with teachers or I was coaching teachers in their instruction. And I feel like over time, I got really interested in what motivates teachers, what makes them excited to grow in their own development instructionally. And then as the pandemic hit, I got even more interested in what's going to sustain teachers as we are dealing with so many challenges. So really, I was just motivated to get into research so I can advocate for teachers, hopefully get into some policy work to help continuing them to stay in the field and improve their instruction.
Excellent, thanks. Juan, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, prior to coming into the program, I was already in a position where I was leveraging some skills towards research and program evaluation. However, the focus there was on the local context. And the more I engaged with the work I was doing, the more I had questions about just the broader context beyond my experience and wanting to explore questions at a deeper level as well. At the same time, I wanted to make sure that I contributed to the creation of knowledge that was also applicable to helping improve student outcomes.
Super, thanks. And Avery.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, during my master's program, I got a taste of research and working with sort of large scale data sets and quantitatively analyzing those. And I wanted to do more of that. And in my professional career, there wasn't much offering to do that because you're working on day-to-day operations and such. And so really wanted to spend time looking at research questions that sort of leverage the use of public data that are out there and then sort of engaging with that in a way that sort of also contributes to new knowledge and unanswered questions, but also that it can be applied back to practice so that you could take it back to the sort of administrative side of things. So making that connection was what really drove me to the PhD program.
Excellent. So yeah, I mean, this is very representative of our program, I think, in the sense that, you know, there's a clear focus on like research is the thing that is going to get me the means to the ends I want to do. And I think you hear in all three responses, this sort of marriage and intersection of like, you know, it's not just about theory, it's theory into practice. And I do want to see some practical outputs, and that my research matters in the real world. Awesome, thank you guys. So let me open this next one up to just anyone who would like to chime in on it. You know, you guys are all incredibly talented individuals, like you ended up choosing Hopkins. Why? What was appealing about the Hopkins program? How did you guys think about fit, if you did? Would love to kind of hear people's thoughts and reflections on that.
Yeah, I can jump in. In thinking about why the programs at Hopkins, for me, it was two things primarily. One was the apprenticeship model. So this notion that I would get to work with a faculty or several faculty members directly and closely on a number of projects, and that through that process, that would help me transition not only from a student, but eventually into a colleague. And two, that Hopkins has various research centers that are affiliated with the School of Education. So I think there's a Center for the Social Organization of Schools. And for my particular case, I was very interested in the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, or BERC, which now I'm a part of through the work that my advisor does.
Great. And either Sarah or Avery, either of you guys want to hop in?
Sure, I'd be happy to give a brief statement. So for me, I think I was driven to Hopkins. I think absolutely that apprenticeship model is, I think, one of the driving forces. So the opportunity to work with my advisor. But I also knew I wanted a program that was going to be quantitatively focused and have offerings beyond just maybe one or two requirements, but that were actually going to apply those at multiple levels and different perspectives and approaches. And so the Hopkins attraction was for that within the School of Education, and then also outside that. I think the opportunities kind of aligned for me there.
Great, thank you, thank you. Anything to add? Yeah, Sarah?
Pretty much I was going to say the apprenticeship model and the quantitative methods research, because I didn't have research experience. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, very helpful though to know that like even folks without research experience, you know, that's not a deal breaker, and you should still apply. Well, let me layer on an extension of that same question, I guess, which is, you know, you guys seem incredibly wise at this point. Like, oh, I was considering all these factors, and of course it made sense. And you know, we also know that hindsight is 20/20. If you could go back in time, and I'm sort of asking you to put yourself in the shoes of the folks who are listening, who are thinking about program fit, but like, how do you know? Like, how do you figure out like, okay, Hopkins is a great fit, but these other programs are, you know, sort of good on this front, but not so good on that front. Like, how do you, what specific strategies did you engage in to try and figure out that big fit question?
I'll jump in. So when I was thinking about fit, I almost visualized like different buckets of fit, where you can have like an advisor, and then maybe coursework, research opportunities, geographic location. And obviously, I mean, if you're looking at several programs, even if it's an incredible program, it's very unlikely that a program is going to be 10 out of 10 for you in each of those buckets. But maybe based on your experience, think what is most needed for you. So like, for example, I loved where I lived prior to this, but I was able to move. My husband works remotely. I was open to moving, especially since Hopkins is in a city. I wanted to be in a city. So the geographic location was not my biggest priority. Whereas, you know, I didn't have research experience before this, and I really wanted to work with my advisor. So those buckets took precedence for me. So I think it's really taking time to self-reflect on what you need based on your experiences and what you're willing to sacrifice a little in order to get what you need.
Great. And just to, I love the idea of sort of prioritize buckets. And so, you know, it's like you're creating a bucket list. And so you were thinking about geographic location, advisor, coursework. Can you remind us what the other couple were?
Yes, and research opportunities. Like for me, that was a huge priority for me. With coursework, I had had a lot of coursework before in educational pedagogy stuff, and Hopkins courses aren't as much like young adult literature pedagogy, things like that. So that wasn't as big of a priority for me as having research opportunities. And Hopkins has a ton of those. You can jump into research very quickly. So does
Great.
that answer your question?
Yeah. No, that's perfect. And I think for other people, like stipend will be a bucket. You mentioned partner in there, and the partner bucket is, you know, got to take care of the partner too. So their flexibility or capacity to move is another big one. So the buckets will vary from person to person, but I think that's a helpful way to think about it. Avery, Juan, what else would you add into this?
Yeah, I would say that for me, it was also thinking about, so in addition to what Sarah mentioned, also thinking about how, whether or not I could see myself working closely with specific faculty members. So really doing the best I could to see who was at the School of Education and reaching out proactively to a couple of faculty members, just to have some conversations to see what they were thinking in terms of their own research agendas, but also to share what my interest in my research questions were.
Great. Avery, any other things or ideas or thoughts you want to chime in with?
Oh, those all sound good. I think the prioritization for each person's preference and having honest conversations with yourself and whoever you need to about that, I think is wise counsel.
So there's a quick question in the chat about whether the program is offered virtually, and it is an in-person program. There may be like 1 or 2 classes that people end up taking virtually or hybrid. But for now, you should definitely want to be in Baltimore, definitely want to plan on an in-person program. That's not likely to change anytime soon. All right, so we're sort of identifying Hopkins. We feel like we've clarified a couple different ways to think about fit. What kind of pro tips do you want to give us for like how you went about contacting and communicating with faculty, sort of either before or as you're pulling your application together? What should these guys know about, you know, reaching out to faculty, the conversations you have with them, kinds of questions you're asking?
So I emailed my advisor. I just sent an email and expressed I'm interested in working with you, because just a few quick sentences. I think in that email, I also included my CV. I might have included a brief writing sample. And I asked those questions that Hunter indicated about, are you taking a student next year? Like, what do you foresee with this? And we were able to hop on a Zoom. It made it very easy for me to see how we might work together. And actually, he was able to connect me with some of the students he's worked with before too, which helped me get a sense of, yeah, just what kind of advisor he would be. So I really do recommend doing that. I know not everybody did it, but I think it was beneficial for my process and helping me know what to expect, but also getting on his radar. So.
Great. Avery, Juan, what did you guys do to reach out to respective advisors?
Yeah, for me, I did the same. I emailed a couple of people. I also was lucky to, in my prior position, be working with someone who was already part of Hopkins, who also connected me to additional faculty. So that was a nice way to connect with potential advisors. I also just want to say that I too, just like Sarah, found that talking to students, advisor students, was also another really good way to get a good sense of whether or not you think you might work well with an advisor, or in a larger group with co-advisees.
Excellent. Avery, I'm not sure if you have anything to add, but a question that also just popped up for me is, do you guys end up talking sort of just research with prospective advisors, or is there a bit of kind of like working style and, you know, what projects are like, how you kind of work on projects? Do you talk methodology? Curious about whether those kinds of things came up as you're like, in some ways you're almost interviewing prospective advisors. And so, yeah, curious for any thoughts on those slightly more specific questions.
Yeah, for me, so I didn't reach out to anyone before I applied, but during the course of the interview process and the sort of visiting different places, that's when I started to have more extended conversations with advisors. And I would say that the bulk of our conversation was around more of just how the program kind of works and the working relationship that he expected of me at the time during the first year, which was really just focus on your coursework. And then we would start a project that following summer. And then, so we didn't spend too much time diving into research. Of course, we talked about my interest, but that wasn't really the bulk. It was kind of sort of, this is how he would like us to approach it. And it sounded good to me. And the fit has certainly worked out. So thinking through that, other people sort of have on current projects or ongoing projects that they would add a student to, which might be different. And so things like that certainly take shape.
Great. Sarah and Juan, before we sort of pivot on to a slightly different topic on the personal statements, any last bits you want to add in there?
Yeah, it was helpful for me to ask him about like what working with him would look like. You know, give me a rundown of the first year. What are some basic things? Or you could even ask about meetings. How often will we meet? And what do you like? What's your philosophy on mentoring somebody in an apprenticeship model? And that helped me, again, just know what to expect and just set those expectations up well. So that was helpful in the process.
Great. Yeah, I also feel like asking like if you can get put in touch with current grad students who are working with that advisor, that's a really good way to ask some of those questions too. Like, not that it's bad to ask the advisor directly, but you know, getting a second opinion on like, oh yeah, we meet, you know, once a week, and the students say like, yeah, it's more like once every 3 weeks. You know, that's kind of a data point. So all right, so we've sort of taken you guys back in time to kind of what you were doing in terms of communicating with faculty ahead of the application, as you're sitting down, getting ready to work on the application. What recommendations do you have for, you know, asking for recommendations? Like, how did you think about who did like, can you coach them on what to write on your behalf? Like, how, like, give us the inside scoop on what you did, and or and it could be either direction, right? What you did and don't do that again, or what you did and you thought it was good and successful.
Yeah, so for me, a lot of what I would say will come from what my master's thesis advisor was giving me. And so at the time, he was guiding me through this process. And so one of the things that he recommended was primarily, if you're able to, people who can talk about that have taught you at the master's level or the graduate level, and classes you were successful in, participated in, got A's and grade inflation notwithstanding. And thinking about, because they are able to see your contribution as sort of research potential, and that ability to talk to that, I think, is probably the most important. But we also have people that come from more professional side, and that capacity can still be spoken to through projects you've done for work and dedication and communication through that as well. So I used all faculty from my master's program for my letters, and sort of I shared my statement with all of them and got feedback on my statement from them as well, and then sort of shaped it that way. So that way we were all aligned on what I was talking about and how they could speak directly to that personal statement.
Yeah, I just to build off of what Avery said, if you're someone who has not had as much research experience, finding someone who can at least speak to your personality traits or the soft skills you have that will help you in learning research. It should be somebody who knows you well enough to speak to that, because that was something I was worried about coming in. I had a few professors from my master's program who could do that, but yeah.
Do people commute from DC? Is it recommended to live in Baltimore? Would just love you guys kind of quick take on that.
I know there are some people that do commute from DC, and it is doable. You just have to be very intentional about planning. For myself, I live northeast of Baltimore City, up in Harford County, so I'm diametrically opposed, the other direction, and I would say it's also very doable from where I am. So you don't have to be directly in Baltimore City, but I think there are a lot of areas around the city that you could live, and getting to school is very manageable.
And Juan, I have sort of a hypothesis, and as the senior member of the group here in your 4th year, I think it's maybe easier in your latter years to do the sort of like further away commuting kind of deal than in those first couple years when the coursework is a little more intensive. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. That's right.
All right, so before I left off, I think we've gotten all the way through. You guys are asking people for recommendations and strategizing around the who and how to think about sort of rounding out places where you have maybe a little less experience with a recommender who can speak to some of those other pieces of your CV that might maybe be a little thinner. As we shift into the personal statement then, strategies and suggestions you have for writing that up and how to think about and strategize on that one.
Yeah, so for this one, I was thinking especially with the sort of research proposal, research question that you put forth. I think one of the things you want to do is you want to set it up so as a way to whatever prior experience you have or whatever previous work that you are putting into the statement, kind of how that motivates that question or how it supports your ability to address that question, but also knowing that. So on my personal statement, the research project I propose has nothing to do with my dissertation, really. And so you're not married to it in the sense that Hunter's going to hold it up in your 3rd year and say, Avery, you wrote this down. Why aren't you doing this? So knowing that it is an interdisciplinary program, when you take coursework, you will learn different things and you might become more interested in a certain aspect of the research agenda. And so thinking about what application is honest, but also, goes together as sort of a cohesive project, but also knowing that things always change. I think most grad students probably have a shift in their research proposal from that personal statement day.
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I think goes nicely with the sort of ask research questions rather than just listing out your topics that I was mentioning before. Because Avery's absolutely right. Like, after he walks across the stage at graduation, I might tease him a little bit about like, hey, I thought you were going to do research on X, you did research on Y, but no one holds you to that. Now, that said, we do sort of line you up with an advisor and assume you are going in a particular direction. And so there'd be a little bit of, if you obviously fine switching advisors, people do it all the time, but it's a little extra work and sort of swimming upstream, at least for just a little bit till that gets sorted out. Yeah, Sarah and Juan, personal statement strategies, any gems of wisdom from you guys?
I mean, for me, it helped just to take as much time as I could on the front end to craft as best the personal statement as I could. I would work on it very intentionally, then set it down, then come back to it later. I know this sounds odd, but I would read it in front of a mirror to see how it sounded for flow. And I also had some, especially people that were recommending giving recommendation letters for me, I had them read it as well, just to get their input and feedback.
Great. Awesome tips. Hadn't thought about the reading it in front of a mirror. I like that one. Yeah, Sarah, what might you add to that, if anything?
Yeah. I mean, you've been saying the word fit a lot, right? So I think it is important to really try to hit home if you are applying to Hopkins, why is it a good fit for you and what will you bring to Hopkins? You can also think of it as kind of a quick snapshot of your story. What have you done so far? How has that driven you to the research questions you're asking? I think as much as you can do to be super specific and make yourself stand out, that will help because there are several applications coming in. So those are
Yeah,
all.
good. Yeah, and I really like that idea. Yeah, I feel like you kind of implied, right? It's a two-way street. And so there should be a set of things that you sort of bring to Hopkins that will be exciting for us as a faculty and as existing students. But then there's also a set of things you hope to get out of Hopkins, and being able to articulate those, I think, is a good way to think about that fit question. All right. So yeah, I'm looking at the questions. Did you consider getting an EDD? Why the PhD over an EDD? We didn't touch on that exactly, but I think largely the answer was, this is a research degree and people are very focused on wanting to do research as opposed to sort of educational leadership. The prior sessions, if you didn't catch those, there's sort of a slide and a little bit of a discussion about the compare and contrast between the EDD and the PhD. So feel free to take a look at those as well. All right, last question, and then I'm going to queue up our audience to definitely start asking their questions because we'll open it up for Q&A after this one. Now, hard to imagine since you guys were 100% successful in getting in, but if, hypothetically speaking, there was anything you would go back in time and do differently about your application process, if you could do it all over again, and, in some ways, like, a lot more about the faculty now, anything you would go back and do differently if you had that magic time travel machine? And if the answer is no, because I got in, like, all right, fair enough.
I mean, I will say this is a hard question, but I think to Juan's point earlier about front loading as much as you can, I just remember the period of applications being so busy, especially while working another job. So I think doing as much as you can on the front end of at least drafting and getting feedback from people, sending your statements to your recommenders so they can see what your research interests are. I think I did those well, but maybe I could have done it even better. I think being proactive really helps.
Yeah, no one has ever said, gosh, I wish I'd left it a little bit more to the last minute. So I think that's absolutely right. Getting started early and allowing that time for, kind of key people in your network to give a little feedback. That seems wise. Juan, Avery, anything else, or should we open it up for questions here? All right. Okay, so yeah, the Q&A function that I think will be on the bottom of most of your screens. And I will, helpful if you ask sort of like globally applicable questions, and then would definitely encourage if you have like super specific questions, you can email me later if they're more about the sort of admissions process and sort of logistical stuff. Seon or Tanya would be more than happy to answer those kinds of questions. And so the one I'm reading now, would you, poised and interested for a PhD program, would you have me discuss this with a potential faculty supervisor or not good enough to start it? Yeah, so I think, Sarah, I think the spirit of this question is like went and did a master's that was not like a research intensive master's, but now I'm feeling like I'm ready for a PhD. And I feel like this sounds a little bit like how you would kind of conceptualize your pathway to the PhD program. Any thoughts about like in the application process, if you haven't been doing lots of research, things to particularly pay attention to or think about or focus on?
Yeah, I was the same. My master's program was not research intensive, and that is something I do recommend talking to your potential supervisor about. Obviously, being explicit with what your experience is, and again, asking what type of projects could you see me working on based on my experiences? What are the types of courses I would need to take to be able to do that? I would say at least probably like half of the people in our program have not had a ton of research training. So the courses are set up so you can be trained in it, but talking to the supervisor, again, in your application, communicating what about you would help you in this challenging undertaking, that's all going to help you.
Excellent, thanks. One other question that just kind of quickly occurred to me that might be helpful for folks to hear about was sort of, like on the one hand, challenges you feel like you're facing now in the PhD program, because that, depending on what your answers are a little bit, could implicate sort of how people think about their application process. Or, not to be too negative, were there favorite parts of the PhD program now that you're here that you think might be worth folks knowing about? So either challenges about the personal challenges that you felt as part of the PhD program, or sort of best parts that you think are useful for folks to know about at this sort of early application stage.
Well, when thinking about the challenges, and I also will have a positive one as well, I think the first year and a half is very, very much course intensive. There's a lot to balance, and it's a strong pace, but it is certainly doable. I mean, there are several students that have done it, all of us on this call as well. So I think figuring out what that rhythm is for yourself, whether it's working in the mornings, whether it's reading in the evening, whatever that may be, I think figuring that out as soon as you're able to, I think helps a lot with that because it is a large scale amount of work to do and sort of different types of thinking as well that go along with different coursework. And then on the other side of that, I think I've really enjoyed the relationship I've had with my advisor. I know we've talked about the apprenticeship model a lot, and as we've gone on in years, I think it's been very fruitful. And we don't only talk research either. So I think there's also a piece of that, whether we talk about, businesses that are failing or the latest comedy special. I think that's sort of part of the relationship building that helps us work together when we're going through working on a different project that is research focused. And I think figuring out that rhythm, I think, has been wonderful. And I've certainly enjoyed that piece.
Yeah, I would say from my end, perhaps one of the most challenging times that I'm sure many can relate to it was when COVID happened and a lot of what we did had to go virtual. So we were no longer in person. There's feelings of isolation, not being as connected to the program. However, for me, one of the best things about the program has been all the students in the program, the ability to have a group of very connected peers. We have formed, especially students in near the same year as I am, have formed the writing group together. We often present at conferences together. And just having that support network has been really important. But also just for prospective students, I know a lot of us are very happy to answer questions that we get from prospective students, just being open to share our experience. And I know when I was exploring the program at Hopkins, I benefited from a lot of student feedback as well, and that was very helpful for me.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on what you said. I think the communal aspect has been my favorite part so far. We do like bi-monthly PD sessions where we all come together and talk about different career topics, and that's a cool way to get to know people across all of the levels of the program. but I'm also very close with my cohort and have learned a lot from them, even though we all have different research interests. And there's a lot of cross collaborations on research projects among the program of students. So that's been very rewarding. And I think the most challenging thing for me that I'm actually working on right now is actually just learning when to say no to things, because honestly, this program, since it is the apprenticeship model, it's a little more flexible with the types of projects you get to work on. You get a lot of opportunities thrown at you, and it's really important to figure out what is going to drive your academic identity forward with the interests you want. So that's something I'm currently working on, is just identifying how is this supporting my interests. If not, say no for now. It might open up opportunities for other things later. So it's a good problem to have.
No, that's great. Yeah. And I think another good point that sort of came out of those three answers is it is a smaller program, right? So your cohorts are small. We sort of target like, 5 plus or minus students a year. And so that might be sort of 25-ish, maybe 30 at the most students enrolled at any given time. And so we do try and do a lot for sort of vertical integration so that as a first year, you're getting to know some fourth and fifth years. So we've got just a couple minutes left. So I want to make sure if there are any last burning questions, people have a moment to type those in. And maybe while that's happening, I'll just say a quick and very heartfelt thank you to Avery and Sarah and Juan. Great stuff. I think I'm looking forward to reading like much better applications as a result of this conversation. So thank you. Yeah, here we go. Oh, well, thank you for the kind comment. Yeah, any final things, give a holler, and otherwise I'll hand it back to admissions to kind of close things out.
All right, thank you, Dr. Galbeck. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here today. Thank you again for your interest in the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Here on this slide, we have some important contact information. Any admissions related questions, please reach out to my colleague, Tanya McMillan. Any program related questions, please reach out to Raven Minervino. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.